The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. So if you want to hit record there, you can. You'll have a copy on your computer that way if you like, but obviously either way, it doesn't really matter too much. So I guess first things first, sorry for the mix up with sending you the tournament version. I don't know why I thought that was the appropriate one at the time. I got through grading and I was like, wait a minute, he's not talking like a tournament player. And I was like, then I realized. So
Yeah, I
it's not
just
a big
assumed that
deal.
was the only one, but yeah.
Yeah, no. It's not a big deal. There's a few questions that are different on the cash one, but mostly it's just tweaking like the stack sizes that I'm asking about. So just taking some of the stuff that's like 30 big blinds and translating it to other stack sizes. So not really a huge deal. It doesn't really alter any kind of interpretation too much. I think in general, just to share my screen now, I'll show you what I came up with. I think in general, everything is honestly, you're very much in the right direction. Like there's a lot of positives for sure. There's a lot of areas where you're doing a really good job of laying out the theoreticals, the basic principles and the main ideas that are influencing, how we're building strategies from the top down and things like that. So there's a lot of really good stuff. I think I will kind of summarize it at the end, but the main areas that I would probably say could use some refinement are just a lot of the ideas that firstly kind of relate to river situations, also some ideas that relate to exploits and how you're thinking about some of those situations. So there's just kind of a few different micro level interpretations or applications of certain ideas, and we can spend some time on those, but overall, a lot of really positive stuff for sure. So to go through starting at the beginning in general, this answer to the question of polarization, obviously really good. The only couple of things that I would point out here, if I just refer to the notes that I have on the side, is first of all, I don't know why I can't see that top note right there, but I guess the first thing to note specifically is, I don't know why I can't see that. Oh, there it is. Okay. So there's a couple of things at the very top, which is that it's all this at the beginning is mostly accurate, although a range with nut advantage doesn't necessarily have to be a polar range. So for example, like we can get to the flop and the flop is ace, king, X, and we have a big nut advantage, but that doesn't mean that our range itself is polar because we still have plenty of medium strength hands in there. And then the other thing that's noteworthy here is that for the most part, polarization specifically is giving villain an incentive to call with hands that are effectively bluff catchers. So with hands that are not beating any of our value range. And this part about, I think there's a word missing here because I think there's something about the sentence that doesn't quite track, but I think the thing here is that villain would only be folding 100% of the time, is that if they arrived at a node with only bluff catchers and we were under bluffing, if they had any hands in their range that were ahead of some of our value, which in most cases they probably will, it's not that common that they get to a node with exclusively bluff catchers and nothing in their range beats anything in our value range, then they're not going to be folding 100% of the time. So this is more of a theoretical than a practical thing.
Okay.
The other thing that I think is really interesting, and this is something that comes up a lot, and I've noticed this like consistently throughout the time that I've been coaching. I think I wrote an article about this same thing like probably 10 plus years ago, but it's this idea that polarization is not an action that we take. It's an adjective that describes the range or a range. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So because people talk sometimes about,
right.
Sorry, say that again.
It's what happens to the range rather than what you do to the range, right?
Yes, but also it's not something that happens to the range so much as it's just it's a descriptor of the range, right? So like a strong or a weak range that's a descriptor. A polarized range is also a descriptor. A linear range is a descriptor. So I think the reason why it's important to clarify that is because quite often players will they'll tie themselves in knots a little bit thinking about, they'll take a situation where their range is actually not particularly polarized. Like it doesn't have distinct parts where there's clear value and clear bluffs and things like that. And then they try to take a what they think is a polarizing action. And it's true that a big bet by nature should come from a more polarized range than a smaller bet. But if we're thinking about what the word actually means, the word itself just describes a range of hands as opposed to it being something we can voluntarily do. So that's quite, I think, an important, just a slight tweak there. And then this sort of explanation here, all very accurate at the bottom. The only thing I would have liked to see in here really is just an expression about the idea that the two different portions of a polarized range capture EV in different ways, right? So the value bets make money and the bluffs break even. And I think you captured later on when we talked, there's a question about the full strategic role of bluffing. You did talk about bluffing in the right terms in there, where our bluffs are breaking even and so on. But the justify why part here, or the justification of why a polarized strategy is optimal in certain spots, is specifically because the bluffs in the bluffing range will break even, and that will allow the value bets to make the most money. So this is just highlighting that key scenario here. I think you did also mention the ace, king, queen game here. So it's certainly, I don't have any doubts that you understand that, obviously. It's just, that's pretty sure. Yeah, of course. That's a pretty central aspect of polarization, I guess is what I'm saying, just to clarify that idea that the value bets make money and then the bluffs break even. So just important for that question. This one, we can skip the ICM ones because again, that's tournament related. We don't need to worry about that.
Yep.
This one again with, my comments here are, framing it in terms of more of a tournament scenario. So we can kind of assume that this is more of a 100 big blinds effective kind of a situation. I think that it's, what's kind of interesting, right, is that in some sense, the strategy that you came up with here is potentially a little bit better than the version I was assuming, because if we're talking about a cash game context and we're talking about a different sort of a set of ranges, the bet 40%, 50% might be a bit more reasonable, just because villain has slightly fewer trashy offsuit hands that they're defending pre-flop when we're deep stacked, we're playing cash and so on. However, there's a couple of things that I would probably say about the overall sort of assumptions that we're making here. And a big part of it kind of connects to this area here, right? Which is any sort of connectedness in the 8, 9, 10 jack is going to want to continue. So that's a fairly good target, easy call against 1/3, et cetera, et cetera. The connectedness in that area will have some incentive to call, but in particular, the reason why this is a good board to probably range bet is because against 1/3, it's that exact region of hands that we're putting in an awkward spot. It's this region that is, kind of indifferent between maybe raising, maybe calling, maybe folding. Some of the stuff the Broadway stuff that wraps around the queen is also going to be pretty indifferent against 1/3 and things like that. And that kind of, I think, is sort of part of the reason why a smallish bet 1/3, probably not too much bigger than that, actually does function pretty well. Because if we were to go, let's say we were to go as big as like 50% here, I think we would start to get the territory where a lot of that connectedness in this region, even with a backdoor, is going to start wanting to fold. So I think we're starting to get to a point where maybe our estimation of where the boundaries are of what we continue with against certain sizes on this board are a little bit off. But for the most part, I think the general idea of this question is, can we identify that this board is most likely a range bet board? And you did, or at least you identified that it's a good frequency bet board. I think that so there was a couple of times where you mentioned the idea of being a bit more linear, and I'm not 100% sure you're applying it correctly, because being kind of linear here in this case would not imply that the bottom of our betting range is king 10 off. It would kind of mean that we're just betting like, I guess what I would refer to here is you mentioned like we still have easy folds facing raises, but we have some good cards on the turn. Part of the problem is that if we are betting a linear range, then inherently a linear range is a range that has tough spots against a raise, right? Like it has a lot of hands in it. Like a linear range here would be a range that includes like a 7, pocket 8s, pocket 6s, ace 3 suited, stuff like that. Hands that are like good, but don't really want to face a raise, right? So the thing about it is that none of what you're saying here is necessarily wrong, but not all of it matches up with the rest of it. If you see what I mean, you're kind of pulling concepts from a couple of different areas that don't necessarily relate to each other. And I think particularly if we were going to go somewhere closer to 50%, even if we would go with B40 here and we're maybe not necessarily going with a range bet, I think that King 10 off is actually one of the hands that it's right in the territory where it might want to check at some frequencies, simply because if we bet King 10, then the only better hand that folds is King Jack. And there are not really any worse hands that call to any significant degree. Not really that much worse King high that's calling. So King 10 is like right in that territory. It's kind of like ace 9 or something here. It's like right in that territory where if we're not range betting, then these are the hands that benefit the most from a check, because they want to keep in the stuff that they're ahead of. And then as a big blind, like we didn't really need to go into the big blind stuff because this is much more about the building the button strategy here. But it's kind of interesting that we say the bottom of our continuing is 4-5 with a backdoor. And then you say the bottom of our pure calls is 8-9 with a backdoor.
Yeah.
So like I say, again, it's like, I can see the logic behind each individual thing. But but like pure calling 8-9 with a backdoor here against B40 might be a bit loose. And at the same time, folding 4-5 even without a backdoor, folding 4-5 suited here would be really tight. Like folding a gut shot. It's not like a gut shot to like a crappy end of a straight. It's like a gut shot to the nuts, right? So 4-5 is like a check raise here, not a fold. So just kind of micro level stuff in terms of how we're actually constructing. So just kind of refining and doing some construction stuff is probably something that'll help. In terms of optimal frequencies and things like that, the main thing that I would kind of focus on in terms of what we might have missed here is you didn't mention SPR, right? Which is a big deal here in the sense that, I don't mean that it's like a big deal that you missed it. I just mean that SPR is a big deal in that our C-bet frequency is going to massively alter as the SPR changes, simply because the change in the SPR changes how wide we can stack off on a given flop. And as the SPR gets lower, we're going to get closer to a point where a big portion of our range is going to be content to stack off. So we actually get more aggressive as the SPR gets lower in a lot of cases. And this is particularly from out of position as well. When we're out of position at a medium to low SPR, we get to play quite aggressively sometimes. But out of position at a really high SPR, if we're playing some kind of 300 big blinds deep single raise pot where the SPR is like 30 or something absurd, like we're going to not be able to do a lot of betting from out of position in those spots. The other thing that I would mention here is that the correlation here in terms of advantage and bet sizes and things like that, this is all generally accurate, but I think that it's worthwhile to clarify that there are plenty of situations that exist in sort of all four corners of the categories, if you see what I mean, and that there are small bet, low frequency spots, there are large bet, high frequency spots, and then there are the two that you've already mentioned as well. So it's not necessarily the case that we can just kind of generically look at things in terms of advantage. That's something that before we really had the ability to break down solver outputs and look at aggregate reports and things like that in as much detail, that was a pretty productive and useful way to talk about situations. But I think these days we have a lot more nuance in terms of what we can identify about bet sizes and how they're used on different boards. So each of these things that you say here is correct, but we just have to flesh it out a bit more in a couple of different dimensions. And there's a couple of tools and graphics that I can show you at some point that sort of illustrate that. So we'll definitely tap into those later on.
Yeah, I watched your video recently about, it was like a grid you had where they had how many weak hands, how many strong hands. to
Yeah,
decide.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking of. Yeah. So
Yeah,
that
that
graphic
really helped me because I think I wrote that before I watched that video and then watched that video. I think
yeah, sure.
yeah,
Yeah. So that's exactly what I was going to show you. And I think it's a really useful sort of a tool because it kind of illustrates that there are going to be certain situations where if we do have villain's range has tons of weak hands and no strong hands, we can just shovel in a pile of money. And then, there are other situations that obviously are the opposite. So yeah, this one here, equity realization, all of this is pretty good in terms of the way that you're phrasing everything. I can sort of, it's funny, I can see like you use the word capitalization here. We definitely used to use this a lot in a lot of Solve for Why content. I think these days, this is a bit of like a shortcut for ideas that we didn't really have a ton of ability to flesh out back in the day, that, this word kind of did a pretty good job of describing these things. So things like how we construct strategies based on equity and how equity shifts around, things like this. This word did a pretty good job of helping us discuss some of those things. But these days, I don't really use this word anymore. I think it's still true that betting and raising is essentially capitalizing on our equity and things like that. But I would say the way that I would phrase this now is more about equity realization, as I put down here. Equity realization is the thing that connects equity and EV together. So a hand's equity realization is how we get from how much raw equity does this hand have to how much money does this hand actually make. And another way to look at that is that equity realization is essentially the ability of a certain hand or a range of hands to make good decisions across three streets or make profitable decisions across three streets. Because let's say, the example here that you gave, it kind of is relevant. Like I kind of get where you're coming from this example, but a better example or a more simple example might be a hand with bad equity realization is going to be like, let's say you get this king queen four flop. If you have pocket sevens, your hand might have 50% equity against range or even more, but you're not going to realize 50% of the pot. You're not going to win 50% of the pot from out of position because you're so frequently going to be forced to fold that hand at some rate. And then by contrast, you might have a draw here. When you have ace eight of spades, you might have 50% equity against your opponent's range on this board, but you're actually going to realize way more than 50% equity because when you actually make the flush, you're going to get paid off. And then, of course, you're also going to win the pot sometimes without making the flush as well, because you get to play this hand aggressively. So that's kind of how we would define realization. It's about that relationship between how much would your hand make if it was just checking down to showdown versus how much does your hand make if you actually have to play all the streets. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And then, of course, the relationship of position there is obviously players who are in position just get to realize more equity because they get to check behind and see another street so much more easily. Yeah. Cool. This first part here is very good. Explanation of the ace, king, queen game, all good. The second part, you did the same thing that almost everybody that's answered this so far has done, which is mixed up MDF and pot odds. Yep. In that when you place a pot size bet, it's true that you're laying a price of 2-1. However, this is where we go off the rails because the calculation for 2-1 pot odds is we only need 33% equity. We don't need 50% equity. The separation between these two things, or the way to really like mentally break the link between these confusing concepts, is that MDF is a range level idea. So it's at the level of, with our overall range, what percentage of our range are we calling with? And you kind of identified it later on as well. So I think you know that. Yep. And then the pot odds, basic pot odds, they are a hand level question, because with each individual hand, you need to have a certain amount of equity in order to call profitably, right? And so in the end, when you're calling a river bet, in theory, you're supposed to, when you're facing a pot size bet, you're supposed to call half of your range, and that half of your range has to have, every hand that calls has to have at least 33% equity against the betting range, right? That's the marrying together of those two concepts. But generally speaking, I think it's it's clear that you understand both of them. It's just interesting that everybody seems to mix these two things up pretty frequently.
Yep.
And yeah, this idea of having the same amount of value hands as you do bluffs, like you never actually need that, right? You never need to have 50-50 because your opponent's always getting better than getting better than 1-to-1. So if you ever did have 50-50 on the river, you'd be over bluffing quite a bit.
Yep.
This one also good, but I think just kind of probably in the big picture, maybe focusing a bit more on overall player pool tendencies rather than individual players, because you're not going to get as many accurate reads on individual players, but not a huge deal. This is, it's not a great question. So I don't think, I think I'm going to change this question because it's, fold equity it's a concept that's useful to know. I think really the way I would kind of explain this is more conceptual than specific, in that we don't really have to do the math on fold equity. It's just that fold equity is an important concept because being able to win pots without needing to have the best hand is obviously such a big part of overall well-rounded strategies. So the idea behind this question was mostly just to highlight the value of non-showdown winnings, red line. It was kind of to highlight that, and to also to potentially highlight the idea that if we're looking at pre-flop all-ins, for example, a useful way to use the concept of fold equity might be if our opponent is a fish and they 4-bet to 2/3 of their stack pre-flop, like it's important that we recognize that we have no fold equity in the sense that they are never going to fold to our shove, right? And it's also quite important if our opponent makes an ambiguous kind of a 4-bet size, we have to try to decide, do I have fold equity here? Is my opponent ever going to fold, right? So that's a useful application of that idea. But yeah, not a crucial question there. This is a tournament one, so we can skip that. This one's interesting. I think the overall approach that...
And so, like, I've been thinking about this probably, this answer for like 5 days. Like,
it's funny.
Thing I did wrong and I can't really,
It's funny. Everybody that's answered this hates this question. Everybody is saying that. And on the one hand, I don't know if that means it's a good question or a bad one, because the reason I deliberately phrased it in such a way as to not give what the early street action was, because I wanted to see if people would do exactly what you did, which is to mention that the nature of the earliest street action is going to have a big impact here. I wanted to make sure and to clarify that people aren't just looking at it and saying, well, in a generic sense, there's a sort of overall strategy, and that people are recognizing, well, it depends, and you did that, you did recognize, there's differences in what the turn sizing might be and things like that, which is good. However, I think there's another instance here where you're a little bit too focused on kind of linearity or mentioning linearity, because one way or another, just the nature of this board, even if we just look at it up to the turn, ace, king, 9-9, it isn't really possible for a range to be linear on this board, because it kind of either has like an ace or better, in which case it has really high equity because every ace has a king kicker here. Every ace chops with every other ace. Or it has a 9 or a full house or something, in which case it has almost 100% equity. Or anything worse than an ace is pretty low equity, right? That's kind of the nature of a board like this. Like a linear range here would kind of imply that we're like betting a king sometimes, which we're definitely not likely to do on the turn here, right? Like I can't really find any circumstances where we would do that. So I think you did correctly identify that this river bet size here is not that big, right? I think that was an important part of why I chose 75% for this and not like a big overbet or anything, because you did recognize like, okay, this is probably not an ideal size for this spot, things like that. You did account for a lot of that stuff, so that was all good. I think the element that I probably would have said you maybe missed is you kind of mentioned here like a strong linear range that bets its strongest ace X on the turn. Well, The thing about that,
strongest, yeah.
I'm sorry, say that again.
It's strong. Any ace X is
That's kind of, exactly what I was going to say. Yeah. Like just that every ace is like the same strength here. And that sort of isn't even because of the turn bringing the 9. You're right that it's kind of an action killer. Like I understand what you mean by it's an action killer here, but in fact, what it does is as opposed to really killing action, it only kills action for like an ace, right? It obviously improves a 9, which means there's a certain portion of range that the action isn't killed because now any 9 wants to play a big pot, right? So it's not so much that it's an action killer, it's that it's just a card where an ace can't really bet again.
Okay.
And I think on a turn, I would expect to see a very polar action here. Now you're right that if we did see a smaller size on the turn here, then it might come from a different kind of a range. But I think that, I think the overall kind of perspective here, I would probably say is that I think you're getting a little bit wrapped up in the specifics of like, how would I play this spot as opposed to the actual nature of the question, which is the step-by-step reasoning process you'd use to break down these ranges, right? So what I was kind of looking for here is something along the lines of like, okay, the reasoning process is, okay, how big did villain bet on the flop? How big did villain bet on the turn? What do I think villain's turn value bet range is? Does this river card change anything in that turn value range? The answer is probably no. What price am I getting? Like, what's villain's river value bet range? Now, what do I think villain's river bluffing range is going to be? Like all of these questions, these sort of sequential processes that we go through, that's the kind of thing that I would have wanted to see here. So basically all of that is being considered. Like you're thinking about all of that at some point in this process, but you're just kind of jumping around a lot. You know what I mean? Like it's not really a sequential thing or a process that's structured. It's a little bit more just kind of, what do I think the vibe of this spot is? Do I think they're under bluffing? Maybe, maybe not. This is what I would do here more so than an overall process. Does that make sense?
Yeah. More, you want to see more of like what your breakdown is sort of in the actual hand rather than trying to break down exactly what the range is where you have unlimited time.
But well, it's not even so much about in the hand versus when you have unlimited time. It's more just about there needs to be an ordering of the things that you're prioritizing, as opposed to it's almost like metaphorically, I kind of imagine you get into this spot and it's like all the information is kind of rushing into your brain at once and you're like struggling to get it out on paper, you know? Whereas what you kind of want is like just a bit more of a breakdown of like, okay, what are the ranges that arrive at this spot? What's the SPR? What's the size that I'm facing? Like all these different elements, you just want to consider each one at a time. And that's going to lead you to hopefully a pretty clear and logical decision-making process. And it's not that this decision-making process isn't logical, but there's a lot of jumping around from like, what's the value range? What are the bluffs? How much showdown value do we have with this? You know, and then we kind of end up being like, let's call some queen high at the end. And that's kind of wild because if you're calling some queen high, like what are you folding here? You're facing a triple barrel and you got so turned around going into the weeds of what the range looks like that we end up like, let's call queen high, you know? And in reality, the place that I was kind of expecting people to end up here is pretty much just like, if we have an ace, this isn't that big of a bet. We beat all the bluffs. It's decent to at least consider calling with an ace here. That's like where I was kind of wanting people to get to, is just arrive at like an ace is a bluff catcher and maybe even a king can potentially call because we're not facing that big of a bet and we might be facing an over bluff. But you did a good job of like, you recognized that, you know, villain has a 9, you know, and sometimes and things like that. Like I had one person who answered this question and just like completely glossed over the possibility that villain could have a 9, you know, so clearly, like, we don't want to do that. We don't want to just forget about that. Nothing in here was necessarily like wrong exactly. It's just like, we just want everything to be a bit more sequential, a bit more structured.
Yep. You want like a system, break it down.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Now, this one here, I think is interesting because what I was kind of mostly looking for here is just the simple kind of aspect that the main reason why ace king 3-bets or 4-bets is because it can get action from worse. It's because if we 3-bet with ace king, our opponent is going to call or even 4-bet with worse ace highs or king queen or stuff like that. And if we 4-bet ace king, it's because our opponent is going to call a 4-bet with ace queen suited or king queen suited or whatever else, right? Those are the things that actually contribute to this hand having EV. And in fact, when we have ace king, we don't really care what our opponent does with jacks or tens. Like the same way that if we have jacks or tens, we don't really care what they do with ace king, because one way or another, neither of those things is really contributing a lot to our EV, right? It's like if we know that our opponent has ace king and we have tens, and we have the choice of we either win $100 pot right now or we play a $200 pot and we flip against ace king, like it doesn't really matter, right? There's small nuances because of course they don't have exactly 50% equity, but it doesn't matter in the big picture. What does matter is if we have ace king and we know that our opponent has ace queen, we would much rather play that $200 pot with 75% equity instead of just winning that $100 pot right now. So it just comes down to, when it comes to hands that we're flipping against, our opponent gets back half of every dollar that they put in. So it just doesn't affect us that much. But hands that are way behind, hands that are way ahead, every time we get a way worse hand to call or a way worse hand to 4-bet, we make a ton of money. Every time we get a way better hand to fold, we make a ton of money. So the thing that I was kind of looking to highlight here is that if our opponent hypothetically is 3-betting so tight that they're not 3-betting ace queen, flatting ace king probably would be pretty good, because 4-betting doesn't serve a purpose anymore. And similarly, if our opponent was, maybe they were opening pretty wide and they're pretty loose, but they are, we 3-bet ace king and then they 4-bet, and we know that they're just never 4-betting ace queen. Well, now 5-betting wouldn't make any sense because we never get a fold and we're just praying that we're not up against aces or kings. We're just flipping. So the general idea here is we just want to hone in on what's actually making us money, right? What's actually contributing to our EV. And it's better hands and worse hands. Flips, we don't really care about. It's just a bonus. This is really good. I think there are probably some better ways to explain things, just splitting hairs a little bit. A solver isn't a computer necessarily, like a solver is a software program, but it's the way I like to refer to it is it's a glorified calculator. And you're right that this is exactly how we look at them. All of this is really good in terms of how we use solvers to understand the mechanics and so on. The only thing that I didn't comment on it in the comments here, but the clunky aspect here that I meant is it basically runs until it finds an almost perfect strategy to never lose money if the hand is played infinite times over. It's splitting hairs a little bit, but I would prefer to describe this as to maximize the amount of money won more so than to say never lose money, because this kind of implies that a solver always wins the hand or something, or it's just never going to put money in bad. But in fact, the solver is going to put money in bad pretty frequently. And lots of parts of a solver strategy involve losing the pot and losing money. It's just that it maximizes EV in the long run in that case. So when I explain solvers to non-poker people, I explain it a lot in terms of it's like a combination of a chess computer and just a raw calculator, right? It's like it's a chess computer in the sense that it's running strategies over and over again, but it's a calculator in the sense that it just uses brute force, and it doesn't have, like, the reason why we have to study solvers and the reason why we have to take time to understand what the strategies are and how they work is because the solver itself doesn't have any internal logic other than math, right? It's literally just a math program. And our job is to try to interpret that in some kind of a human way that we can use. But all of this is really good. Definitely very clear that you understand exactly what we're doing there. This is a bit more tournament focused. So my answers here, again, not really as relevant, but I think what's interesting is there's a lot of your answer here would be quite relevant for tournament stuff, but would be way too wide for cash environments.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah, sure. So that's good to just clarify.
Yeah.
And I think the cash version of this question is about the same spot, but at like 200 big blinds, right? So it's just kind of fleshing out the way that we're constructing. I think you did, even, considering you're not really a tournament player, like you did a really good job actually explaining the different aspects of the strategy here. And obviously there's some stuff that I could split hairs on, but it's just not necessary. I think the general idea here is we're going a little wider for value, stuff like that makes perfect sense. A reasonable approach that I would tend to take here when it comes to looking at a player who's a bit wider than normal is you can just shift your perception of their opening range one position later or two positions later. So if we're dealing with an under the gun 9 player that we think is a bit looser than average, just give him an under the gun 8 range and just use whatever your defense strategy is against under the gun 8. And then do under the gun 7 if he's really loose, right? Or go even further than that if he's like an absolute maniac. But you can just take your big blind defense strategy against a wider position and just use that. And it's very serviceable and very functional. So that's a pretty reasonable approach there. This one is quite interesting because I think there's a couple of aspects where I think you're very accurate, very correct. There's a couple of aspects where maybe needs a little bit of refinement or we're slightly missing the point a little bit. So this one here, the first part, keep your range uncapped, generally pretty important. Yeah. Balancing your range. Yeah. The second sentence of if you're always betting top pair, you become exploitable. Your opponent can just go nuts when you check. This might be true if we're talking about if you always bet top pair across every single board texture, it might become exploitable. But there's plenty of situations where you can and should bet all your top pairs, right? There's a lot of situations where that's applicable. And there's a lot of situations where we're just range betting. So we just always bet everything in our range, right? So, contextually, we just have to be adaptable. And it's loosely true that if we never have better than one pair in our range, villain can go nuts with bluffs when we check back. But it's not always as true as it might seem, because even if we just always have exactly one pair or worse, that doesn't always allow them to go nuts as much as you would think, because sometimes our hands that were one pair on the flop are going to improve on the turn to potentially 2 pair or some other kind of hand. So it's very texture dependent, basically. This is, the second sentence. I see what you're getting at here about not using always and never, but there are things that we should never do because they're just strategically bad, like donk jamming the flop for 10x pot. Like there are certain things that are just, in game theory, they're referred to as dominated strategies. They're just strategies which are universally losing. And so we shouldn't use them. And then there's also things that we can always do without any kind of fear of being punished because it's simply the optimal strategy to always bet a certain situation. So we just want to be, again, context dependent there. This one, again, is like, if you always bet when you have better than a 9 kicker and always check when worse, you become super exploitable. I mean, you might become marginally exploitable across all runouts, but like this wouldn't even be that big of a deal. Like what we're kind of talking about really, and the reason for this question really here is I think there's really 2 instances where mixing serves a significant purpose. And by mixing, I'm mostly referring to actually randomizing. And it's, first of all, when you're playing against very strong opponents that have a good understanding of the overall nature of what ranges look like. And you want to make sure that you can still retain the ability to take a lot of different lines post flop. You can still retain some bluffs in various different lines. You can still retain value in various different lines. So some of these low frequency mixes can be very important against very strong players. And then the second thing is in instances where the EV is very close together or where you're simply not sure, mixing can be quite powerful in pretty much just preventing yourself from having any kind of cognitive bias over time. Because if you were to get into 100 spots where calling and three betting are both roughly equal EV pre-flop, and you just always take the call option because you just like playing a low variance game, that's definitely going to result in you over time becoming a very passive player. And then conversely, if you always take the aggressive option, again, that's going to result in you becoming way too aggro. So mixing is helpful for those purposes, that it allows you to take some of those spots where either option is good and there isn't really a clear and obvious benefit, and just avoid exhibiting a specific tendency that a good opponent could pick up on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. This one, very reasonable response here. I mean, I would go so far as to say that I don't even think you need to see your opponent do this more than once. This is one of those things that I think, because it's a completely dominated strategy, like a solver will never cold call a 3-bet in the small blind. You just shouldn't do it. And if you see someone do it, you can probably assume they're a fish, because the vast majority of good players are just never going to do it. So I think that's a pretty reasonable read to make. Again, this second comment here is a little bit tournament focused. I think you're probably right that in cash games, a lot of these players are quite wide, but it's also, that it's funny because there's multiple different ways someone can be a fish, right? And I think with any weak player, once you establish that they are a weaker player, it's that there's going to be a number of different directions that their approach can go in. They can be the kind of player that are going to be way too wide here and going to have too many offsuit Broadway combos and stuff like that. But there are also going to be a lot of players who are very pair heavy, who are very heavy on a lot of like suited hands. They just don't want to fold and things like that. So I wouldn't go too far into assuming specifics of their range in a lot of situations until you have more info. But I do think it's very reasonable to just be like, okay, this guy flatted a 3-bet in the small blind, or this guy cold called a 3-bet in the small blind. He's a fish.
Yeah,
totally fine. Next question is pretty interesting, because I think this one is one that people have struggled with when I've put this to other people as well. You're not wrong about this in terms of the application of these ideas, big blind 3-bets, things like this. There's some comments that I left about some tournament-based stuff, but we can ignore those. I do think the couple of things that are relevant here is that one of the main defining factors of the difference between a polar range and a merged range in 3-bet context is that a polar range it distinctly has hands in that range that are benefiting from getting action from worse hands. And then it has hands in it that are benefiting from getting folds from better hands. And it doesn't really have anything in the middle that's kind of ambiguous between the two. So it's all about where the EV is coming from, right? So you're not wrong about the assumption here of the nature of the definitions, but the way you applied it here, something like King 8 suited and getting King 10 off to fold, you're right that getting King 10 off to fold is a good thing, but getting Queen Jack suited to call is kind of like, we don't care. Like, it's neutral because it's flipping against us basically, right? We're not that far ahead of Queen Jack suited. What would really be more of a merge here is like you 3-bet King 10 suited and King Jack off folds, but Jack 10 suited calls. That's kind of more what we're thinking about. So you're along the right lines here, but in order for King 8 suited to really be part of a good merged range, you would need like King 7 or below to be calling, which it probably isn't in most cases. Or you can maybe argue that like 8-7, 8-9 are calling, which they probably are, but the flip side of that is you're also getting called by Ace 8 suited. So King 8 suited is just kind of a hand that it's not a bad hand to 3-bet, but mostly when we're looking at a merged 3-bet range, we're looking at hands that are some hands in that range that are basically gaining EV from multiple different sources, basically. So they're not distinct value bets or bluffs. And that would be one that includes like the suited Broadway stuff, the suited connectors where, sometimes we get better hands to fold. Sometimes we get like other suited connectors to call. Sometimes we just benefit from board coverage. There's a lot of different reasons that hands like that can work well in a 3-bet range. But a polarized 3-bet range, we're never going to have that middle portion that's kind of unclear where the EV is coming from. In a polarized 3-bet range, everything is either obvious value or an obvious bluff. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Yep, some of this suited stuff, yeah, this makes a lot more sense in cash for sure. That's all good. MDF, again, you got this right. This is, very reasonable about them, printing 10% pot share by you overfolding. That's good. The only thing that I would say is that it is actually correct that there are plenty of situations where like strategically we do fold more than MDF. MDF does not apply in like a vacuum, because what we're really looking for, or what we're really doing strategically, is, especially when we're out of position, it's not necessary that we make it so that our opponent captures exactly 0 EV by bluffing. It's just that we need to make it so that the EV of bluffing is equal to the EV of checking, right? We need to keep them break even between checking and bluffing. So if our opponent's potential bluffing range has hands in it like potentially ace high or something like that, well, that hand might have like 5% equity, right? So if they're making, I don't know, half a big blind of EV by checking, then all we really need to do is ensure that they don't make more than half a big blind of EV by bluffing. And what that will do is it will actually manifest itself in situations where we quite often are just folding more than MDF. And I tested this by looking at a situation where I looked at a river sim, and it was a line where it went check, bet, call on the flop, turn went check, we checked the river, and then villain bet pot on the river in position. We're facing a pot size bet, exactly pot. Our folding frequency in that spot was 62%. And it's because villain has a lot of hands there that, even if they have like queen high, right? When the pot is that small and the ranges are still pretty wide, queen high might win like 10% of the pot by checking.
Yep.
Which means that it's okay for us to allow them to win 10% of the pot by bluffing with queen high. And what's important is that specifically the portion of their range that has no showdown value at all, like I don't know if they have like 5 high or whatever, right? What we don't want is for them to be able to profitably bluff with like 5 high, right? And some of that nuance about exactly what the ranges look like, it does end up with some situations existing such that we fold a bit more than MDF. And that's particularly true in circumstances where our range does include like value raises and bluff raises, right? The more raising we're doing on the river, the harder it is for villain to profitably bluff, because it reduces their ability to value bet. Therefore, it also reduces their ability to bluff, right? And so what you will also find is that the more you kind of give yourself more and more hands in your river range that could theoretically raise for value, if you're raising for value a lot, or if you're bluffing a lot as a raise, you don't need to bluff catch very much, because now you're going on the offense again, and you're making them into a bluff catcher, right? You're making them bluff catch. So like I said, none of this is wrong, but the 50%, including value raises, bluff raises, in practice, like, probably isn't the case. It's mostly just referring to bluff catchers, basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Cool. This was good. This is really good. Bluffing is about making your opponent indifferent with their bluff catchers. Exactly right. You reference the ace, king, queen game again, so that's all good. Everything just kind of recognizes that we're bluffing for the purpose of getting paid off with value. That's great. This example, it's a good example, but I also think that this is a thing that cash players do a lot, is going a little bit too far down the rabbit hole of what your opponents are thinking instead of what they're doing with their range. You could easily be correct here that he would never think of paying you off if you hadn't shown down king high in a similar spot a week earlier. But the problem is that you don't have, it's entirely possible that he doesn't even remember this.
Yeah,
and the reason why he tanked is just something completely different, right? And the danger with this is that the more you go down this rabbit hole of trying to estimate exactly what they think as opposed to just what they're doing, the easier it is to take it one step too far and believe that we have just that little bit extra confidence in our opponent's thought process than what we actually do. And if we do that in a situation where, particularly on earlier streets, if we start to make an assumption on the flop or an assumption on the turn, and then it changes the way we play the river, it's kind of a compounding effect, and things can go progressively more and more wrong as we go through the streets. So just be a little bit careful about the going too much into what they're actually thinking.
It continues to cost me money.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's a good one to stay mindful of for cash games for sure. Cause especially when you play with the same players regularly, it can really be a minefield trying to think of like, oh, what's he thinking? What am I thinking? But that's kind of why optimal strategies exist, right? Cause it's your way of pulling yourself out of that leveling war and not having to try to understand exactly what level your opponent's on. This one, we can ignore this one because this is ICM again.
That question, I do occasionally play tournaments, but am I sort of on the right track here saying that the medium stacks are going to have to be super tight if we do call?
Yeah, you are. I mean, I think I guess specifically referring to the calling range against two shoves. So the main thing that I was kind of wanting to highlight with this question for tournament players is just that because we are facing two very tight shoving ranges, even though there's not actually any significant amount of ICM pressure on us when we're the chip leader, we still have to be very tight simply because the ranges that are actually shoving are very tight. And even if there was no ICM at all, if the ranges that are shoving are just only like really good hands, we shouldn't call with like king, queen suited. So that's kind of the whole thing. And then the idea of what the stacks behind us do, it's pretty common for players to think about that. But actually, the other thing I should address here is we don't really ever call wider than chip EV. Chip EV is a baseline for tournaments when there's no ICM at all. And as soon as there's even a little bit of ICM, there's the vast majority of situations we go slightly tighter, even at worst. There's only a few very specific types of scenarios where we can actually call wider than chip EV as a chip leader. And a lot of it relates to being in position with such a big stack that the players in the blinds don't get to like squeeze us at all. And so we just get to flat on the button with tons of hands, but that's obscure. That's not really a big deal. The general idea here though, is outside of these ICM spots where we're considering stuff like what can the blinds do, for the most part, the thing that we want to pay the most attention to is the ranges that are already in the pot. So the players that have already put money in the pot are always going to be more important. And then anybody that's left to act behind, because they have 100% of hands and by nature, they're just going to be folding a ton anyway. We don't want to let them influence our decision-making too much unless one of them's like a huge whale and we're playing a cash scenario where we just want that guy to be in the pot or something,
Yeah.
So this multi-way one, this is good. There's a lot of good logic here. And again, it's a pretty reasonable overall strategy here, but the main thing was it's not really a framework, that kind of a thing. It's not really like
it's the same as
sequential of like who has position on me, what's my range look like, what's the board texture, who has the nut advantage, like all of these questions that we can answer. I would like to see a bit more of that, more so than just this is what my strategy is, right?
Yeah.
So again, not incorrect necessarily, just like slightly different approach I would have taken. And then I think also there's a couple of things that are a little inconsistent. Like I think it's very reasonable to be check raising your overpairs a lot here, especially if it goes like bet, call, and then you get to raise. But I don't think that you necessarily benefit very much from like trapping that often when when there's no call in the middle, right? Like if your opponents are stabbing too liberally, then you kind of benefit from just raising more in general anyway, whether or not there's a caller in the middle, right? The caller in the middle just makes it's just even bigger of a bonus, So I don't think you really need to trap a lot here, basically.
Yeah.
And then, check raise bluff ranges and some of these multi-way things, we will definitely talk about these. The general dynamic about a lot of multi-way hand selection here is that we have a lot more capacity to play aggressively multi-way than what most people would think. But card removal and specific properties of individual hands just start to matter a lot more. And we will probably find that there's hands that wouldn't feel like good bets heads up that actually become very good bets multi-way. So good example here is a hand on this board that would be really good to bet is like 10-9 of clubs, or king 9 of clubs, possibly as well, queen 9 of clubs, stuff like that. But simply because, like, let's say we have 10-9 of clubs, well, we can bet this flop, and sometimes, depending on the action, depending on the exact situation, we might be able to bet 10-9 of clubs here, and occasionally somebody's going to fold like ace 9 of diamonds because they just have diamonds and they don't have any straight draws. But at the same time, we can also get called by like a flush draw, right? So these things can happen. And because people fold a bit more in multi-way spots with these like second pair hands that don't have draws, things like that, there's a few kinds of different considerations that we want to have multi-way. So I think spending some time on a couple of multi-way concepts would be useful. The, stuff like if we have Jack 9, I'd probably bet, that's reasonable. But, the main kind of reason to bet Jack 9 there is just because a two pair hand is inherently a bit more vulnerable to being counterfeited than a set would be. So we just kind of want to get value right now. I think saying your bets would be few and far between here, I think you're like loosely correct, but I think you'd be surprised here where if you are up against ranges that are too wide, you can do much more betting than you might think in spots like this. One of the things I've found from a lot of the multi-way sims that I've run, and I put this in some of my Solve for Why multi-way courses, if you ever get the chance to watch those, is that if you add more ranges to a spot, more players to a spot, but those ranges are much wider than what they're supposed to be. So if you go from 3-handed to 4-handed and the fourth player has a range that's super wide and really trashy, it really isn't going to actually change things that much because a trashy range is not a scary range, right?
Yeah.
And then when you look at 5 and 6-way pots and things like that, inherently, in order for a 5 or 6-way pot to happen, somebody somewhere has to be way too wide, right? Because those hands are not supposed to happen in theory. So what actually kind of ends up being the case is that there's a lot more possibility for aggression in 5 and 6-way pots than you might think in some situations, as long as you pick the hands correctly and you pick the bet sizings appropriately. In this case, I think even if we went like 5 or 6 ways, because we're the only one in the hand who can have an overpair here, I think we're always going to be able to have some reason to bet. And it might even be that we can bet a third of our range here or something like that, even 5 or 6 ways in a lot of situations. Because Jack 9-4 is never going to be that bad of a board for us. The boards that I think what's actually, let me just sort of add one thing onto that. Boards like this, where one way or another, it's unlikely that players, there's no flop straight, and it's unlikely that players are going to be able to have the offsuit 2 pairs here. Even if they can have the suited 2 pairs, they're not really going to have offsuit 2 pairs. There's a big difference between what we would do on Jack 9-4 and say Jack 9-7, because if you change that 4 to a 7, just the fact that it's 3 to a straight, I think that would immediately shift me to like, I'm checking my entire range, because just the fact that it's Jack 9-7, and it's so much more connected. Not only does it mean that players can have 10-8 for a flop straight, but it also means that there's a lot more suited and offsuit 2 pairs in their range. So you want to look out for particularly disconnected boards like this, where players can only have some of the 2 pairs or potentially none of the 2 pairs. If the board was like queen 6-3, right? You might legitimately find a situation where you go 4 or 5 ways to a flop, but none of your opponents ever have 2 pair because they never have 6-3 suited, queen 6 suited, queen 3 suited, whatever, right? It's rare, but it might happen. And that would actually be a spot where you could bet that flop quite a bit because they never have 2 pair, right? So using the 2 pairs as a bit of a guideline is kind of a nice shortcut in a lot of these multi-way spots. Because if you think about a board texture and you say, okay, how much 2 pair am I up against? If the answer is very little, then a lot of your strong one pair, like your pocket aces, your over pairs, they're pretty happy to put some money in. But if the answer is there's a lot of two pair out there, you're not going to want to put a lot of money in. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. So all of this very logical, but yeah, I think some multi-way stuff would be good. And then finally here, this is all good, except for the example you picked is a little bit of a left field, kind of obscure sort of example. I would have probably just said more in terms of a specific hand and a board. I would have just said something fairly simple, like you kind of allude to it here, but like we get to the river, there's a 3 flush on the board. We have the ace of the flush suit. We get to bluff the river for a big size there because we're blocking the nut flush. Anything that just relates to like being able to bluff a flush river more often with a card of the flush suit, things like that. Just that's a general perspective on how blockers influence bluffing decisions. Stuff like we have 2 7s and now we're reducing the combos of 7 8. So we reduce the top pair. Like this is definitely very into the weeds. And it's like, definitely not a prime example of how blockers can be used. But again, it's clear that you understand it. It's just maybe the details are a little bit taken from an odd example here. But so to just kind of wrap up and give some overall thoughts and priorities, definitely very clear that your theoretical knowledge is really good and that you're in a good spot to have the right foundation to really be winning a lot in the games that you're playing. I think that there's a few ideas that we want to kind of refine and get a bit more clear about, which is the flop stuff that we kind of mentioned. There are a couple of ideas that, we just want to refine how we're using certain bet sizes, how we're estimating what defending ranges are going to look like. I think we also want to take a session to look at some multi-way stuff, potentially just looking at how we're building strategies and using that type of Jack 9-4 sort of board as an example. And then I think it would be good to do probably a couple of sessions looking at the river from both perspectives. So thinking about how we might make some aggressive adaptations and how we can kind of build a model for using MDF or using just approximations of exploits in our favor. And then, doing the same thing from the inverse perspective where we're the defensive player. We're thinking about how we can bluff catch. That's usually going to be, an important thing to sort of establish a protocol for. And I have some graphics and some tools like the one that you saw with the flop bet recommendations. I have some more graphics I can use for those. So I think this is how I would probably want to structure the rest of the 5 sessions that we have. Does that all make sense? Is there anything kind of left over that you wanted to ask about or any observations that you had coming out of that?
No, I don't think so. Not immediate anyway.
Sure. How are you feeling about all of it? Does it feel like it's a lot to take in, or is it do you feel like you have a bit of a direction now?
No, just having the 4 things here is good. Yeah, no, good.
Cool.
Good.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, hopefully it reinforces confidence a little bit to see, you are in the right territory with a lot of stuff, which is really good. And yeah, I think in terms of where we go, it's, you kind of have the luxury now that a lot of the improvement that's going to come is going to be much more of a question of just iterating on the strategies and processes that you're already implementing and just refining them, making them more specific, more structured, putting things in place that can just make sure that they don't kind of let you down a little bit when maybe you're off your game a little bit and we don't kind of go down too many rabbit holes in some cases. So yeah, I mean, you have a really solid foundation. And I think that looking at it as it's more of a question of refinement more than any kind of overhaul being necessary, I think that's the way to go. And so I think the next step is just to get you locked in for the next session. You can use the booking link again. You can do the same thing as you did before. And, we'll get set up in a way where we can dive into some flop stuff and use those graphics that I mentioned. And we'll take things from there, I guess.
Yep. Awesome. Okay.
Perfect. Cool. So yeah, you should have the booking link. It should be on Discord still. If it's not, or if you can't find it or anything, just let me know and I'll post it again. But if you want to go ahead and lock in for that second session, then I'll talk to you soon. And obviously, if there's anything that comes up, any hand histories or whatever that you want to talk about, feel free to drop them in Discord because that's what it's for. So happy to talk over all that stuff as well.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Cool. All right. No worries. Talk to you soon then. All right. Cheers. Bye.